those were the questions for now.
Okay, thank you. Then we will continue to the last part. And we will reiterate the thesis of the previous section, that if there are blockages on the one end, or uncontrolled currents on the other hand in a more inner area, that this can lead to an expression of disharmony in a lower area. Just as in fact fever or other external illnesses or diseases are a physical expression of disharmony that has its origin in the mental realm. Now let's again take a look at how migration works. We explained before that it is a natural flow from a high to a low pressure area to create equilibrium or harmony. But this takes place across all levels of being or consciousness. With the three realms in nature or of earth, spiritual, mental and material, and with the mental again being divisible again into three, if we keep it at the human level or the thinking realm, we will show how these three correspond. Now there is an interaction between each of these three realms and they cannot really be separated. There is a mutual influence. But basically nature, as we have told, works from the inside out. There are the natural circulations or migrations that flow from the spiritual or universal level through the mental realm to the material, at least when there is harmony. Compare this to the health of our body. In medical science we are increasingly discovering how important mental well-being is to physical health, and how mental well-being in turn depends on having a meaningful life. When people know from the inside out that they have a function in life, that they are a connecting link in the whole, they are more positive in life and can handle much more and have much more resilience when the going gets tough. Now the same in fact applies, as above so below, to humanity as a whole, functioning as an organ of the living earth. When we function well as humanity, we receive the spiritual currents with the spiritual part of our thinking, and we translate this into the mental realm and into knowledge about the physical realm that we can benefit from. And just as with physical health, disharmony arises when blockages occur in the circulations or flows, or, on the other hand, when there is a kind of uncontrollability or unrestraint. We know how important it is that these flows can continue to function properly and that blockages or uncontrolled flows make us sick or can even be fatal. With blockages you can think of shortness of breath or heart or brain infarcts, and with uncontrolled flows, for example, you can think of hyperventilation, overstimulation of the nervous system, or a cardiac arrhythmia. I will now give some examples at the level of humanity as a whole, also showing the interaction between the three levels. We start with how it works from top to bottom. Now spiritual influence is in a sense imperishable. It is always there. But we have also talked about cosmic pulses. We're now learning more and more about the outer part of that, but actually these pulses are sevenfold. In essence they are spiritual currents, and they also work cyclically. Thus world teachers like, for instance, Krishna or Gautama the Buddha or Jesus or Lao Tzu or Plato, they do not appear by chance, but according to cosmic cycles. Sometimes it is the Messianic cycle of 2160 years, sometimes even bigger cycles like the precession cycle of a little almost 26,000 years. And then there are smaller cycles like every 100 years when disciples of the Masters of Wisdom appear. Now the arrival of Madame Blavatsky and the founding of the Theosophical Society is one of the most recent spiritual pulses. And now this inspiration can only work through if there are people on the mental plane who are fit to receive these influences with the spiritual or mental part of their thinking, their buddhi manas or wisdom thinking. Now, how does this work and how can we cooperate with nature working from within? If the spiritual part in our thinking or the buddhi manas is active in us, then we will recognize that we are open to wisdom. For we realize then that there must be more than the outer life. We ask ourselves certain questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What is the meaning of it all? In short, we are wondered. So we are looking for this kind of wisdom. And this makes us also receptive when we taste something of it. Now, when we encounter this wisdom, the first thing, of course, is to explore such an impulse. What does the teacher want to say? Can we make that our own? Can we make that alive in our practice, in daily life? And are we able to then also pass that on, that inspiration, without giving too much of our own interpretation to it and limiting it again? What you also see many teachers doing is making a connection with previous impulses, also from elsewhere, to show their universality. We too can help in that, to show that the knowledge is in fact already there in every culture and in every place in the world. An example of this is Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, the book which he wrote, which does not fail to link almost every tradition worldwide to the universal wisdom. The universal wisdom that has been brought to our attention again and again, and moreover, she links it in that book to the most recent scientific insights. The work that has been further expanded under one of her successors, Gottfried de Burger. In the mental field, the challenge is to translate the message of such an impulse into solutions to current issues. Thus, all sciences, astronomy, geology, physiology, but also, for example, the practice of agriculture. They once sprung from the knowledge of the mystery schools. Putting that wisdom into practice is only not always easy, not even for the sages themselves. For example, Plato came home empty-handed when he wanted to apply his ideas about statecraft in Sicily. And also Gandhi failed to unite Muslims and Hindus in an independent India. It is further important to work for a gradual introduction when disseminating, so that new wisdom is not treated uncontrollably. For example, yoga or mindfulness from compassion as an underlying motive would probably be interpreted quite differently by the West if sufficient attention was paid to the underlying rich yoga philosophy or Buddhist knowledge. Surely now it has rather received the association as something to be used in the short term and for personal gain. This closes the gate to deeper wisdom. In fact, good transmission of spiritual knowledge need not necessarily lead to physical diffusion at all. Remember the principle, think global, act local. And in the spiritual realm, you can even call it think universal, act local. Because in the higher part of our consciousness, we are actually at home in the universe, and our place, wherever we are on earth, doesn't really matter. We can be a living example and inspiration of that wisdom at any time, in any place. But if we succeed in making a good translation of spiritual insights into the mental realm, then this can also lead to a harmonious spread in the physical realm. This then involves, first and foremost, the exchange of wisdom from person to person, and then knowledge through books or other media, including the necessary translation into other languages, and finally only the knowledge of physical or material things, such as technology. whether it's about building houses or farming. Now, an example of this exchange in these three areas of thought, from spiritual through the mental to the physical sphere, is the Silk Road. Although best known as a trade route, we definitely do it short if we see it only as a trade route. There has also been a great deal of exchange in terms of knowledge and culture along this route. Based on mixing styles in art, for example, you can see that with the Silk Route there has also been a rich exchange between Eastern Buddhist wisdom and Greek wisdom, for instance. You can see that, for example, in the statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas such as these, found in what is now Afghanistan, and that were made based on both styles. It's interesting that it's precisely when cultures collide that the civilizations flourish, as they did along the Silk Route. And how could it be otherwise? We are inseparable, and therefore isolation is also in fact something very unnatural. It is precisely the blending of cultures and identities that leads to more civilization. Now, we have now outlined how we as humanity on the mental plane can help migrate the flows from spiritual to material realms of thought. And we will now show what happens when these flows falter, due to blockages, or on the contrary, when they flow or overflow uncontrollably. And then how this leads to physical waves of migration as a result. Now, an influx in spiritual thought can be blocked if dogmatism occurs over time, for example. Wisdom can actually grow infinitely. But if a certain group appropriates and starts enforcing a certain interpretation, for example, then dogmatism arises. They say, this is how it should be and not otherwise. Then there is no more open exchange, and the flow of inspiration from inner areas is also blocked. Now, another form of blockage is blockage in spiritual thinking is isolation. Just as there are practitioners of religions who withdraw from society and walk their path in isolation. While this may mean a more rapid progression of spiritual abilities for the individual, from the compassionate point of view, it is actually a blockage in the spiritual realm. In addition, in the spiritual field you can see examples of unrestraint in, for example, blind faith or fanaticism. In blind faith, one actually skips the mental part. Instead of trying to understand the deeper layer of teachings, to grasp the symbolism and to see the logic of teachings, one skips this step and turns to blind faith. And this blind faith in turn can lead to fanaticism, an uncontrolled flow. Like the Christian crusaders actually tried to spread faith with the sword. And another example of uncontrolled flow in spiritual thinking is the Christian expression pearls before swine. That is, that you share certain things that another is not yet ready for, which can cause another to reject wisdom prematurely or perhaps even to use it selfishly. That's why there have been esoteric or secret movements in all kinds of traditions to protect wisdom from that. Sometimes these blockages or uncontrolled spirituality lead directly to migration, but most of the time it is indirect. As an example of direct migration, one can think of conscientious objectors. This was the case, for example, at the beginning of the Enlightenment, when the Netherlands, with a little more religious tolerance, attracted people like Descartes and Spinoza. Or the migration of the Huguenots from France to the Netherlands, who had to flee the Inquisition. And you see it now, for example, with the persecution of Rohingya in Myanmar, who by nearly 1 million had to flee to Bangladesh because of religious fanaticism. But usually blockages or unrestrained indirectly lead to migration. If wisdom and a sense of oneness or an idea of spiritual reality are lacking, then a person is not taking his inner desire or aspiration for immortality or oneness seriously, and a lack of vision on the imperishable inner life then leads to a greater emphasis on this one perishable outer life. The spiritual then no longer flows through, and one then assumes separate thinking in the mental sphere. One no longer recognizes the spiritual influence, or has rejected it because it has become dogmatic or fanatical, and this can lead to selfishness on a mental level. For example, by keeping knowledge to yourself. And think of the idea of intellectual property, to benefit economically from certain inventions. So in the absence of understanding the connectedness as humanity, inequality in knowledge then arises. People do not share knowledge because they think they will benefit economically from it. And this in turn creates high and low pressure areas in the economic field. Another form of blockage in the mental sphere is censorship, as seen in dictatorial regimes. And when the opposition is silenced and basically has to migrate in order to express itself. And what you see now, for example, in Russia. On the other hand, you see that especially in the West, the focus on economic growth is a form of unrestraint. Among other things, this focus on material growth leads to the depletion of nature and also fuels the demand for labor migration. I will explain this a little further. Because apart from wars, that we will come to in a moment, which always trigger peaks in refugee flows, inequality between countries is one of the major causes of migration. In the left graph, we see how there is a worldwide difference in GDP, a measure of material prosperity, gross domestic product. The countries with the highest GDP are marked with the largest area on this world map, and those with the lowest with the smallest. And in the right-hand chart you can see how inequality between countries has increased more over the past 1.5 to 2 centuries more than inequality within countries. And this is mainly due to the focus on economic growth, or the desire for material things. Because material growth is limited by the finite nature of the 3 factors of production in a materially oriented economy. And the 3 factors: capital or property, labor, and land or nature. At first, Western countries were still able to grow through colonization of land, but now that all land and resources are more or less distributed and slowly depleted, and population growth is stagnant, the demand for labor is increasing. Because now capital growth, or you can better say growth of desire, can only be maintained by increasing inequality. It's the winner takes all principle. At the expense of nature and at the expense of honest labor. What is demanded is namely mostly cheap laborers, because those at home have become too expensive and no longer want to do the dirty or difficult work. Meanwhile, mostly rich countries earn from these cheaper migrant laborers, and inequality only increases. And inequality is also increasing within a country, because it is mainly the big earners who get even richer from the cheap labor of migrants, while the public sector has to pay for the possible problems, such as housing, education and care in case of dismissal. Because the main reason for migration currently is still labor or work. If you look at the figures from the EU or the US, the share of labor migrants is overwhelmingly the highest. And the graph on the left, the mustard coloring, which indicates the amount of migrant labor or labor migrants in the EU, and blue in the right graph, where it shows the division of which is the largest in the US. In the EU, the share of labor migration in 2021 was 45%, and this is followed by family migration of 24%, which is often a consequence of labor migration, when the family relatives follow the wage earner. In short, migration is much more a matter of demand than of supply. The demand for cheap labor from the West is the main reason for migration. Migrants therefore do not steal jobs, they fill vacancies. It is the own demand from the rich West to merely expand the material economy that creates the demand. And figures also show that economic growth and migration rates run parallel. But the growth is mostly materially oriented and unevenly distributed, and that is causing more and more problems. Currently, the most dominant characteristic in our thinking is still the desire characteristic, the kama manas. In essence, desire is a longing for oneness and for immortality, but if we do not recognize this in ourselves and guide the desire through higher characteristics of our thinking, such as intellect, insight, idealism, intuition or inspiration, then that desire can start to work out in a more materialistic field. Out of lack of insight, our economic system is mainly focused on this last fulfillment of materialistic desire. And right now we see that this system is reaching its limits, simply because there are limits to material growth. First, we see that we are depleting nature with it, and secondly, there is also a limit to human labor to keep providing more or new products and services to sustain growth. And this fuels labor migration. Again, this actually stems from a lack of spiritual vision of life, both on an individual level with people who flee from ignorance into material cravings, into consumerism, for example, but also on a social level, with politics that focuses on economic growth. It will only become harmonious if we focus on spiritual instead of material growth. For in the material sphere, as the philosopher Epicurus so beautifully said, nothing is enough for those who find what is enough too little. And since desire can never be permanently satisfied with transient material things, what is enough is always too little, and so nothing will be enough. There's always dissatisfaction. Another example of uncontrolled mental flow is a mental epidemic, of fear, for example. Disharmony due to a blockage in the spiritual realm leads to a lack of awareness of spiritual unity or connectedness, creating susceptibility in the mental realm to all kinds of mental epidemics. For example, populists often play on the feelings of discontent, of separateness or loneliness among the people by creating a common image of an enemy. And then the migrant is an easy scapegoat. In contrast, they then set up a sham unity among the own people based purely on external characteristics such as skin color, for example. Precisely when spiritual voices no longer resonate, people seek identity and culture much more in these kind of externals. And this discord between population groups can even lead to wars, which in turn trigger streams of refugees. And so, among other things, misinformation on Facebook led to the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar and the huge refugee flow of 1 million Rohingya to Bangladesh. Finally, the physical realm. We explained that when we keep knowledge to ourselves for economic reasons, as the West does, you actually create a blockage in the mental realm. Because it doesn't flow through in that area, inequality is also created in a lower area, also in physical prosperity. And if people cannot find work or decent working conditions in their own country, they're going to seek refuge elsewhere. Now more and more Western countries like the EU or the US are thinking that they should physically stem the flows by building walls at the border, for example. Now border walls are a fairly recent phenomenon. In large parts of our human history there were no clearly sharp national borders, and people could easily migrate depending on circumstances. It's only recently, especially after the First World War, that more sharply defined and guarded national borders have emerged. More than half of all land borders worldwide have only come into existence since the 20th century. Now borders do not work at all to contain migration and in fact sometimes create uncontrolled waves of migration. Experts give 4 reasons for this. As indicated, most migrants are migrant workers who come because they are asked for work or because they know that there is work in the country of arrival. And when borders close, these migrants often switch to other channels for migration, such as family migration, asylum migration, or illegal migration. Furthermore, you can see that when borders are strengthened somewhere, there is this what they call waterbed effect, and migrants start taking alternative routes. And there are also what they call now or never migration waves, when it is announced, when it is announced that borders are closing. Whereas many people stay in place when they know that they can always go somewhere else, an impending border closure or a visa scheme creates this now or never effect. For example, fear of future immigration restrictions and the introduction of travel visas around Suriname's independence in the Netherlands caused a huge migration surge in the late 1970s where the number of people more than tripled. The 4th reason that strengthening borders does not work is that it interrupts circulation between 2 countries. This actually encourages permanent settlement elsewhere, while people do not actually want to leave their native countries. An example of this is the closing of the borders between the US and Mexico. In the 70s, Mexicans crossed the US border in large numbers. After a while, as many as 85% returned home. But since the 80s, and especially since 9/11, the border has been heavily militarized. And as a result, only 7% now return. And it also backfired in another area, as the undocumented migrant population from Mexico to the US increased from 3 to even 12 million between 1986 and 2005. So you see, here also forms of uncontrolled flows or waves of migration caused by an announced or created blockage. If we go to an example of uncontrolled flows, we of course have the refugee waves caused by war. We have already explained how war arises on a mental level when the spiritual vision of the unity of all life is lacking. Now the fear in the West in particular, that refugees are flooding the country as a result of wars, is totally unfounded. But because the real refugee crisis takes place mainly in the areas of origin, because the majority of refugees have always been accommodated in a region. 80% of refugees find shelter in neighboring countries. and more often also in the poorest countries. For example, 85% of refugees are received in developing countries, and Africa itself hosts 92% of African refugees. So we see how blockages and uncontrolled flows from top to bottom work out and create unnatural waves of migration, of which many people are victims. What does this all mean for working on with nature? We hope to have made clear that we as humanity have an important function to perform, and that the key to this lies in our own mentality, in our own thinking. To what extent are we open to the spiritual pulses that reach us from the heart of the sun and that we can transform on earth on the mental level? For there also lies the key to harmony in nature. To summarize, there are always spiritual impulses. And as humanity, our job is to convert those spiritual impulses to the mental realm and translate them to the physical realm. And blockages, or on the other hand, uncontrollability on the spiritual and mental sphere of thought, work their way through to migration on the physical plane. Thus, if we are able to make the cyclical spiritual impulses leading and to translate them via the mental level to the physical level, we probably would hardly have any problem with the natural, gradual migrations on each level. Then there will be a dynamic harmony with a blending of cultures and identities based on spiritual lessons for the general interest, contributing to a more universal civilization and flourishing of humanity at large. Okay, let's have again the last break of 3 minutes, and then we have some time again for questions. See you then. Okay, welcome back. Mariska, any questions?
No new questions after the third part.
Not this time, okay. Well, then we'll just close. We will, of course, get into more interaction on this theme during our study meeting. So please do not forget to register for that study meeting next week. We hope we can all welcome you and have a good discussion about this theme and how to work on with nature. And then we close, as we always do, with the Gayatri from the Rig Veda, call to the higher spiritual part within ourselves, called the Golden Sun. O thou Golden Sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.